Windsor, a remark, the mask slips. It happened during what should have been one of the quietest afternoons of the season. The royal family had gathered at Windsor for a private luncheon following a charity event, a room full of polished restraint porcelain laughter and the soft clinking of crystal. Then, like a sudden crack in the veneer, came Laura's words. Camilla's daughter, emboldened by familiarity and a lifetime of quiet immunity, made a remark about Princess Anne that would ripple far beyond the table. It was not shouted, but it didn't have to be. Every syllable landed with the weight of insolence. Anne froze. The room fell silent. Even the servers, trained to blend into the walls, halted mid-step. For a woman who had spent her life measured in poise and duty, Anne's expression was chilling, a stare that carried decades of sacrifice, of enduring press scrutiny, and of being the monarchy's most reliable workhorse. Laura's words had not just been an insult. They were an affront to rank, to legacy, to the unspoken code of survival within royal walls. I watched Camilla in that moment. Her reaction was delayed, not the gasp of a mother horrified, but the pause of a strategist calculating. Her smile faltered only slightly before she leaned toward Laura, whispering something sharp yet soft enough not to reach the rest of us. She then turned to Anne with that practiced look of civility, as though nothing had happened, as though the tension had not frozen the air around us. But the damage was done. Anne rose quietly from her chair, placed her napkin on the table, and left without a word. That was the instant when the mask slipped. For decades, Camilla had built her survival on warmth, her genial laugh, her relatable charm, her reputation for being the one who humanized the monarchy. The BBC once called her the monarchy's quiet warmth, while Reuters described her as the steadying figure beside a sometimes brittle king. But in that room, I saw something else, a woman whose composure wasn't kindness at all, but control. After Anne's departure, conversation resumed in fractured murmurs. Camilla stayed seated, her hand resting on Laura's arm with a faint maternal smile. It was the kind of gesture that looked benign in photographs, but in person carried something colder, protection disguised as affection. Her eyes followed every whisper, every sideways glance. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the slight. It was as if she had decided in that instant that the family would adjust to her daughter's outburst rather than the other way around. Later that evening, the palace corridors buzzed with what courtiers delicately called the Windsor incident. The Guardian soon published a discreet line about a misunderstanding at a private royal event. Deutsche Welle framed it as renewed tension between senior royal women, while Al Jazeera's coverage went further, hinting that Camilla's influence had blurred the boundaries between consort and matriarch. To me, the event revealed something far greater than an insult. It exposed the fragility of Camilla's carefully curated image. For years, she had survived by being inoffensive, by leaning into ordinariness, by letting time dull the edges of old scandals. But that strategy had depended on control over her narrative, her family, even the tone of conversation around her. Laura's remarks, so spontaneous and unguarded, tore through that illusion. It showed that beneath the charm, Camilla had built a structure of influence so tight that even her daughter's insolence felt like an extension of it. William's reaction was telling. He did not raise his voice, but his silence was deliberate cutting. Later, I overheard him telling a senior aide, "It's not about what she said. It's about who allowed her to believe she could say it." That sentence lingered with me. It was not just a reprimand for Laura. It was an indictment of Camilla's reach, of her quiet effort to blend her world with theirs, until the lines between royal duty and personal privilege blurred completely. That night, the palace lights burned long after midnight. Anne's absence at breakfast the next morning said everything that needed saying. The remark had exposed more than disrespect. It had revealed how brittle the crown's unity truly was, and how deeply Camilla's influence had permeated its walls. In the flicker of candlelight at that Windsor table, the queen consort's smile had finally betrayed its true nature, not a sign of warmth, but a mask concealing ambition's weary triumph. Maternal shield lines crossed. In the aftermath of the Windsor luncheon, silence became the palace's chosen weapon. No statement was issued, no acknowledgement made, and yet the corridors pulsed with tension. Every whisper carried the same question: how far would Camilla go to protect her daughter? And at what cost? I saw it unfold over the next few days. Camilla moved swiftly and subtly, using the same methods that had carried her from public scorn to the Queen's crown. First, she reframed the narrative within the household. Staff were told that Laura had been misinterpreted, that her comment toward Anne was light-hearted banter, misunderstood by those unfamiliar with family humor. The wording was rehearsed, its delivery deliberate. Courtiers repeated it dutifully, knowing the real intent was not to clarify, but to erase. Behind the scenes, Camilla's maternal instincts merged with her political instincts, becoming indistinguishable. She arranged a private meeting with Anne, or so it was said, though no one outside the inner circle could confirm what truly transpired. If it did occur, it left little evidence of reconciliation. Anne's public demeanor remained unchanged, stoic, dutiful, unyielding. Camilla, however, emerged from those days more polished than ever, smiling for cameras, her public warmth now sharpened into armor. Watching her, I began to understand the essence of her power. It was not loud, not confrontational, but persistent. The BBC once described her as the monarchy's quiet negotiator, and Reuters noted that she survives through charm and steadiness rather than command. But those phrases miss something crucial. Camilla's steadiness is not stillness, it is strategy. And when her family's dignity was at stake, she used that strategy like a weapon. William, however, saw through it. His patience had limits, especially where Anne was concerned. To him, Anne represented the monarchy's unbreakable spine, a woman who had worked tirelessly for decades without scandal or complaint. He viewed the insult not as a social misstep, but as an attack on that foundation. When aides suggested letting the matter fade, he refused. "It's not the comment that matters," he said quietly. "It's the permission it represents." That permission was what troubled me most. For years, Camilla had cultivated the illusion of normalcy, blending her private world with royal life until distinctions blurred. Her children were not royals by blood, yet they were fixtures at palace events, seated beside dukes and princesses. It had been tolerated, perhaps even indulged as a gesture of goodwill. But Laura's remark shattered that delicate balance. It forced everyone to confront a truth they had long ignored. The monarchy's inclusiveness had limits, and Camilla's attempt to stretch those limits had crossed them. In the press, the fallout began to take shape. The Guardian published a quiet but cutting editorial titled, "Respect and Rank the Windsor Equation." It noted how the monarchy's unity depends on the restraint of those who orbit its core. Deutsche Welle reported that tensions within the senior family have resurfaced, raising questions about the Queen Consort's influence. Al Jazeera described it more bluntly. Camilla's success in reshaping her public image may have emboldened her to test the boundaries of royal hierarchy. Inside the palace, the effects were immediate. Seating charts for upcoming events were quietly redrafted. Invitations that once extended to Laura and her brother were suddenly delayed due to capacity. Even the order of precedence at private functions was re-examined. These were subtle adjustments invisible to the public eye, but unmistakable to those within. They were William's way of restoring boundaries without igniting scandal. Camilla, sensing the shift, doubled down on damage control. She arranged new charity visits, ensuring photographers captured her with children, and veterans' images designed to soften to humanize. The BBC aired a segment praising her literacy initiatives. Reuters highlighted her tireless devotion to causes beyond the palace walls. But for all the optics, something had changed behind her eyes. The charm felt colder now, the laughter more rehearsed. In private, she reportedly told an aide, "They'll forgive me anything but being strong." It was a revealing line, one that echoed her entire life story. For Camilla, strength had always been her crime, first in surviving scandal, then in marrying a king, and now in defending her daughter. But there's a difference between resilience and entitlement, and Windsor had blurred that line beyond repair. Anne, meanwhile, said nothing. Her silence, as always, spoke louder than words. In her refusal to acknowledge the incident publicly, she reaffirmed the very discipline that Camilla's daughter had violated. That contrast between stoic restraint and defiant charm defined the weeks that followed. Camilla's maternal shield had done its job. Laura was untouchable, the incident dismissed as misunderstood humor. But in saving her daughter, Camilla had exposed herself. The family saw the maneuver for what it was, a calculated defense disguised as grace. And while the tabloids soon moved on inside the palace, lines had been drawn not in ink or decree, but in silence protocol, and a new understanding Camilla's power had limits. And for the first time, everyone could see them: ambition, duty, and Anne. In the weeks that followed, the Windsor luncheon became a silent watershed moment. Officially, it never happened. But within royal walls, it became a measuring stick, one that defined how far ambition could stretch before duty snapped back. And at the center of it all stood two women who had spent decades navigating those very opposites: Camilla, who fought for inclusion through charm and quiet persistence, and Anne, who had earned it through unbroken labor and self-discipline. Their differences had always been there even before this latest rupture. Anne, the only daughter of a monarch, had never cared for spectacle. Her life was built on work ribbons, cut hands shaken, and a calendar filled not with dinners or speeches, but with service. BBC archives once described her as the hardest working royal, immune to drama, immune to praise. She saw monarchy not as privilege, but as endurance. Camilla, on the other hand, represented something entirely different: the soft power of adaptation. Reuters once called her the survivor of public hostility turned indispensable partner, and that was true. Yet survival, I've learned, has its own kind of hunger. After the luncheon, the tension between them became almost visible. During the next family appearance, a reception for the British Horse Society, Anne arrived first, punctual as always. Camilla came 20 minutes later, accompanied by aides and photographers. They greeted each other with the kind of brittle politeness that only exists in houses where bloodlines are sacred and forgiveness is currency. Cameras captured their smiles, but those of us standing nearby felt the frost in the air. I had seen Camilla face scandal before, and she had always emerged stronger. But this was different. This time her opponent wasn't the press or public opinion. It was Anne, duty incarnate, impossible to outmaneuver, impossible to charm. For all of Camilla's soft laughter and gracious gestures, Anne represented the one thing she could never fully possess: legitimacy, born from duty, not love. It was then I began to understand that this wasn't just about Laura's words. It was about legacy. Camilla had spent years trying to prove she belonged within the royal framework, not as a tolerated presence, but as a pillar. In her mind, she had succeeded. Yet the luncheon revealed that many within the palace still saw her as a guest who had overstayed. That realization hardened her. She became sharper in meetings, more assertive during briefings, and less patient with tradition. The media noticed. The Guardian published a quiet feature titled "The Uneasy Harmony of Two Royal Women." It described Anne as duty's daughter and Camilla as the monarch's shield. Deutsche Welle went further, writing, "Camilla's authority, once defined by charm, now faces its ultimate test: the respect of the institution she sought to humanize." Even Al Jazeera, in its analysis of British royalty, commented that behind every polite bow lies a battle of philosophies: tradition versus adaptation, earned versus endured. Inside the palace, William's position became crucial. His respect for Anne was deep, almost filial. She had been his steady example after Diana's death, a constant presence when everything else had fractured. He often described her as the family's compass. Camilla, meanwhile, had worked tirelessly to win his trust over the years, softening her image through shared projects and quiet gestures. But now that fragile balance was collapsing. William's silence toward Camilla grew colder. His public warmth reduced to formal acknowledgement. Catherine, ever diplomatic, tried to bridge the gap. She arranged joint appearances, seated them together during formal banquets, and ensured the press captured moments of cordial unity. But the strain was visible. Cameras may have caught the smiles, yet even trained journalists noted how their interactions lacked ease. The BBC's royal correspondent phrased it delicately. The Queen Consort and the Princess Royal appear to move in parallel rather than together. Camilla's response was predictable. She turned to influence. Her advisors began pushing stories emphasizing her modernizing spirit. Magazines printed glowing pieces about her charities and her unique bond with Charles. But even these efforts backfired. Social media commentary turned harsh, framing her as manipulative, A poll conducted by YouGov showed a noticeable dip in her approval rating, particularly among younger demographics. One editorial in the Times observed Camilla's problem is not what she has done, but what she represents: the persistence of privilege over principle. And yet I couldn't help but feel a strange sympathy. She was not wrong to want respect. For years, she had been the monarchy's scapegoat, a woman painted as interloper, homewrecker, opportunist. She had endured ridicule, tabloids, even open hostility from the crowd. But survival, when practiced too long, becomes indistinguishable from ambition. Camilla's tragedy was not greed. It was obsession. The need to prove that endurance could equal legitimacy, and by contrast, never needed to prove anything. Her authority came from consistency, not affection. When scandal struck elsewhere, Anne's silence spoke louder than any defense. And perhaps that was the true gulf between them. Camilla needed to be liked to survive. Anne needed only to endure. By the end of that summer palace, aides began using a new phrase: the Windsor divide. They didn't mean politics or policy. They meant philosophy. On one side stood Anne and William, upholding the old order of restraint and duty. On the other stood Camilla, fighting to redefine what belonging meant. In the middle, Charles, torn between love and legacy, tried desperately to keep the peace. But peace, once cracked, rarely holds. The luncheon was no longer about a careless remark. It had become the symbolic fracture between two eras of monarchy: the past's dignity and the present's performance. And Camilla, for all her grace and resilience, found herself standing in the chasm between them. Still smiling, still surviving, yet slowly realizing that endurance in the royal house was not the same as acceptance. Spin, backlash, isolation. The storm that followed wasn't a single explosion. It was a slow erosion, the kind that wears away confidence rather than destroys it outright. For weeks, the palace machinery worked in overdrive to contain the damage from Windsor. Officially, there was nothing to contain. But unofficially, every headline, every photograph, every whisper was a reminder that the monarchy's equilibrium had shifted, and Camilla was now at its most precarious edge. Her communications team, seasoned veterans of spin, launched what I can only describe as a counteroffensive. They flooded the media with stories about her charitable work, her humor, her resilience in the face of scrutiny. The Daily Telegraph praised her as the monarchy's unflappable heart. Hello magazine ran a glossy feature titled "Camilla's Quiet Strength." Even the BBC aired a short documentary focusing on her literacy campaigns, describing her as a consort dedicated to building bridges through empathy. But this time, the narrative didn't take. The public had grown weary of royal rehabilitation arcs. The Guardian countered with a column that asked bluntly, empathy or optics? Social media was less forgiving. Threads dissected every image, every smile, framing them as performances rather than sincerity. She's not connecting, one journalist told Reuters. People see calculation where they used to see composure. Inside the palace, the atmosphere shifted from tense to brittle. Invitations that once carried her name now listed her separately. Anne resumed her schedule without acknowledgement of the incident, her silence as deliberate as ever. William and Catherine's popularity surged with every public appearance. Their authenticity, effortless and youthful, made Camilla seem relic-like, a remnant of an era the monarchy was trying to outgrow. Her circle of advisors began to contract. Longtime aides who had once guided her rise started to distance themselves, quietly citing health reasons or personal decisions. Even Charles's private secretary began limiting Camilla's access to key planning sessions, framing it as reducing workload. Everyone spoke in euphemisms, but the truth was unspoken. She had become a liability the crown could no longer afford to defend. That isolation didn't come all at once. It crept in step by step. First came the scheduling adjustments. Then certain courtiers stopped looping her office into correspondence threads. Later, the social calendar changed: less time at Windsor, fewer state dinners, more private engagements. The monarchy's choreography was rewriting itself, and Camilla's steps were quietly being omitted. What struck me most was her composure through it all. She kept smiling, attending every event as if nothing had changed. But the warmth in her demeanor had hardened into something else, what Deutsche Welle called a smile of survival. In private, staff described her as increasingly withdrawn, retreating to her study for long hours, her desk piled with old newspaper clippings, letters and press summaries from the years she had clawed her way from ridicule to acceptance. It was in those quiet hours, I think, that Camilla began to feel the weight of her own history pressing back against her. For decades, she had fought for control over her narrative first, against tabloids, then against royal coldness, and finally, against time itself. But control is a fragile currency in an institution built on duty. The more she tried to shape perception, the more resistance she met. The breaking point came when one of her closest allies, an old friend from her charity circle, leaked details of a private phone call with her to the Times. In it, Camilla reportedly expressed frustration that the younger ones have no sense of gratitude for what we built. Whether the quote was genuine or paraphrased hardly mattered. Perception had already decided. Headlines blared, "Camilla feels sidelined by next generation." The BBC confirmed the leak but declined to elaborate. That single line undid months of damage control. The public read it as bitterness proof that she saw the monarchy as her personal victory rather than shared duty. Reuters described the fallout succinctly. "In a family where silence is survival." Camilla spoke one sentence too many. The backlash was swift. Social media turned feral tabloids shifted tone, and commentators began using a new word, isolated. Her image as the calm, stabilizing queen consort had been replaced with that of a woman clinging to relevance. Even international outlets joined in. Al Jazeera reported Camilla, once the monarchy's quiet matriarch, now finds herself on the outer edge of royal influence. Charles, loyal but pragmatic, tried to mediate. He privately urged her to take a step back for the sake of optics. She agreed publicly. But those who knew her best said she viewed it not as retreat, but as betrayal. She's built her identity on endurance, one palace insider confided to The Guardian. To ask her to fade quietly is to ask her to stop breathing. By autumn, she was attending fewer official events and spending more time at her Wiltshire estate. Photos of her smiling on horseback or greeting locals surfaced occasionally, but even those looked forced. The woman who once seemed to glide effortlessly through scandal now appeared weighed down by something heavier than reputation irrelevance. Yet even in that isolation, there was defiance. She refused to issue statements, refused to apologize, refused to let history close its book on her. For better or worse, Camilla had become the embodiment of an older monarchy, one that believed survival itself was justification enough. But as William and Catherine's influence expanded, and as Anne's unwavering duty drew renewed respect, Camilla's brand of endurance began to look not noble, but outdated. And so the queen consort, who had once conquered ridicule through patience, now found herself defeated by the very thing she had mastered: silence. For in that silence, the crown was rewriting itself, and this time she wasn't part of the script. Reckoning and what endures. By the time winter settled over Britain, Camilla's transformation from queen consort to peripheral figure was nearly complete. The newspapers no longer spoke of her influence or her role beside the king. They spoke of her absence. In the space of a few months, she had shifted from center stage to shadow, her name appearing only in cautious retrospective pieces that used the past tense to describe her presence. The official line was simple: Her Majesty has chosen to reduce her public schedule due to health and family priorities. But everyone knew what that really meant. She had been quietly benched, her engagements redistributed to Anne and Catherine, her visibility reduced to polite mentions in palace communiqué. Even her office, once bustling with advisors and PR strategists, now operated with a skeleton staff. The quiet corridors of Clarence House echoed with the kind of silence that feels less like peace and more like aftermath. Charles handled the situation as delicately as he could. His loyalty to Camilla remained deep, almost reflexive. But even loyalty has limits when weighed against the monarchy's survival. The BBC described him as a man caught between two loyalties: his wife and the institution he has sworn to preserve. And so the king did what kings have always done. He chose the crown. Camilla, to her credit, seemed to understand. There were no dramatic confrontations, no outbursts, just distance. When I saw her at Sandringham for the Christmas service, she looked composed, regal even, but there was something unmistakably altered in her demeanor. Her smile was still there, that trademark softness that had once melted public resistance. But behind it was exhaustion. It wasn't physical fatigue. It was the weariness of someone who had fought too long for approval, only to realize it could never truly be hers. The press called it a quiet reckoning. The Guardian framed it as the monarchy's subtle course correction, while Reuters described it as the moment when influence yielded to legacy. Deutsche Welle, more reflective, wrote Camilla's silence is both her punishment and her dignity. But to me, the reckoning was far more personal. For decades, Camilla had been the monarchy's paradox, simultaneously its greatest scandal and its most successful survivor. She had walked through public hatred, humiliation, and gossip, emerging beside Charles as the embodiment of endurance. She had rebuilt her image not through grand gestures, but through the steady drip of familiarity, showing up, smiling, staying. Yet the same qualities that had made her endure were the ones that now made her fade. In an era where authenticity was the new currency of royalty, her composure read as detachment, her control as calculation. William and Catherine represented transparency. Anne represented selfless service. Camilla, with all her grace and effort, represented the past, the era of survival through silence. And yet, even as her influence waned, something about her refused to vanish. Perhaps it was her defiance, the refusal to apologize for being herself, for wanting to belong in a world that had never intended to welcome her. Perhaps it was her awareness that history would never grant her full absolution and that she had accepted that truth long ago. Or perhaps it was something simpler. She knew that the monarchy, for all its ceremony, is built not on saints, but on survivors. In private, those who still worked closely with her described a strange calm settling over her days. She spent hours reading gardening, writing letters to charity organizers she could no longer visit. She's reclaiming the only kind of freedom the crown allows irrelevance, one confidant told The Times. For the first time in years, she doesn't have to perform. Her daughter Laura retreated from public view, her husband distancing himself from royal events entirely. That too was part of the quiet reset, an unspoken agreement to separate family from institution. Anne, meanwhile, never addressed the incident again. Her silence had come full circle, restoring the dignity that Laura's words had briefly disturbed. For the public, Camilla's story began to settle into the strange rhythm of myth and memory. Al Jazeera called her the consort who outlasted scandal but not history. The Guardian observed that in time, her endurance may be remembered more kindly than her ambition. And perhaps that's true. In the long view of monarchy, image always outlives action. Looking back, I see her less as a villain or victim, and more as a reflection of the institution itself. Resilient, flawed, bound by duty, and haunted by ghosts it cannot exorcise. Like the crown she once served beside, she was both admired and mistrusted, necessary and expendable. Her triumph was never in conquering hearts, but in surviving long enough to prove she could. Now, as spring approaches again, and the palace moves forward without her name at the forefront, I imagine Camilla at Ray Mill House watching the morning light fall across the Wiltshire fields. She has become a shadow of her own legend, but perhaps that's where she's most at peace. No crowds, no cameras, no court politics, only the hum of a world that has finally stopped demanding she justify her existence. In the end, her story is not one of disgrace, but of inevitability. The monarchy needed her when chaos reigned. It no longer does now. She gave it stability and in return lost herself to its machinery. That's the silent trade every consort makes, and she understood it better than anyone. And so history will remember her not for the scandals or the smiles, but for the truth she embodied, that survival within the crown's walls is not victory. It is the art of fading gracefully while pretending it was always your choice.